The 19th century was an age of magnificent curiosity. The world was being taken apart and catalogued, piece by piece. Great ships crossed the seas, returning not just with spices and silks, but with crates brimming with strange plants, unusual stones, and the preserved forms of creatures never before seen in Europe. In hushed, high-ceilinged museums, men in dark suits bent over these treasures, trying to decipher the Earth's grand, mysterious story. A revolutionary new idea was in the air, changing everything. It suggested that life was not static, but a slow, branching river of change and adaptation. Every fossil was now a sentence in a vast, unfinished book. And in this book, one chapter was particularly puzzling. It involved a creature you might picture in a lush island forest. A being with large, watchful eyes and a playful grace, the lemur. Their home, their entire world, was the magnificent island of Madagascar, a place adrift in the Indian Ocean, a sealed laboratory where evolution had painted with a unique palette. For scientists, Madagascar was the kingdom of the lemur, without question. But then, a whisper of contradiction emerged from the rock. As geologists brushed dust from ancient bones in very different parts of the world, they found something that shouldn't be. Fossils of animals unmistakably related to those island-dwelling lemurs were being discovered far, far away. Not on the nearby African mainland, which would at least be logical, but thousands of miles across some of the planet's deepest, most formidable waters. They were found embedded in the earth of India. They turned up in the soil of Southeast Asia. Look at a globe for a moment. Trace a line from the shores of Madagascar all the way to the tip of India. That is an expanse of relentless, open sea. These small, tree-loving mammals are not ocean voyagers. They do not build rafts. They do not swim great distances. So, how could this be? The question began to haunt the halls of science, a quiet, persistent ghost. How could two families of the same terrestrial animal be stranded on opposite sides of an aquatic desert, with no trace of a path between them? It was a geographical impossibility. It was as baffling as discovering a colony of penguins thriving deep in the Sahara, with no explanation for their journey. This was more than a trivial mystery. It struck at the heart of a new endeavor, understanding why life exists where it does. Scientists proposed answers. Perhaps it was a marvelous coincidence of evolution, two separate lines converging on a similar design? But the bones told a different story. The similarities were too deep, too fundamental. The connection was real. Others suggested a rare, desperate voyage on a mat of floating vegetation, a lucky accident. Yet the sheer, staggering scale of the ocean made this feel like a fantasy. The puzzle refused to be solved. It sat there, an anomaly in an age dedicated to order and reason. A spectral thread connected these distant lands, and the scientific mind, which abhors a vacuum, longed to give that thread a shape, a name, a solid form. It demanded a bridge. Not a metaphor, but a real, tangible path of earth and stone over which those ancient, small creatures could have ambled from one land to another. And in 1864, a man arrived to build that bridge. He would not use timber or iron, but ink and logic, publishing his theory in a dry, scholarly journal. His name was Philip Lutley Sclater. He was no wild-eyed prophet. He was a zoologist and a lawyer, a man devoted to system and classification. Imagine him surrounded by cabinets of carefully labeled bird skins and specimens, a cartographer not of coasts and mountains, but of life itself. He believed the distribution of animals across the globe must have a rational, orderly explanation. And this lemur problem was a tear in his orderly map. In a pivotal paper, he laid out the evidence with crisp precision. He detailed the unique menagerie of Madagascar, noting which common African animals were strangely absent. But he also cemented the frustrating, undeniable link: the lemurs of Madagascar, the pottos of Africa, the lorises of India, all belonged to one family tree. Their locations formed a triangle of impossibility on the map. Faced with this, Sclater considered the options. The notion of separate creations was fading. A transoceanic journey for such creatures seemed absurd. So, He turned his gaze to the map itself. What if the map was incomplete? What if it was missing a colossal piece? He proposed that in a distant, primeval epoch, a great continent had sprawled across the Indian Ocean. Perhaps it was a chain of large islands, a terrestrial stepping stone pathway linking India to Madagascar. This land, now vanished beneath the waves, would have been the highway for the ancestors of all these primates. It was an elegant solution, perfectly logical for its time. And every theory needs a name. Sclater, a practical man, looked to the creature that had inspired the quest. This lost land existed to explain the lemurs. And so, with a simple stroke of his pen, he christened the phantom. He called it Lemuria. There was no magic in the act, no hint of prophecy. It was scientific shorthand, a label for a hypothetical solution. One of the world's most enduring legends of a lost continent was born not in a vision, but in the methodical prose of a research paper. The idea did not sink. Instead, it found fertile ground. To the scientific community of the day, Lemuria was not a fantasy. It was a respectable, even likely, hypothesis. It made the inexplicable data sensible. You must understand, the vision of the Earth they held was different from ours. The dominant theory saw our planet as a cooling, shrinking sphere. Imagine an apple slowly drying out. As its interior contracts, its skin wrinkles and folds to fit the new, smaller size. Those wrinkles, they believed, were our mountain ranges. In this model, the crust moved primarily up and down. Continents could rise as vast plateaus, or they could sink, over eons, into deep oceanic basins. The notion that entire landmasses could slide sideways across the globe would have sounded like utter nonsense. A sunken continent was not a wild idea, but a predictable geological event. So, Lemuria was placed on hypothetical maps of the ancient world. It was a solid, respectable ghost, solving not just the riddle of the primates, but also other strange biological echoes between Africa and India. For a time, in the minds of those Victorian naturalists, Lemuria was real. One can almost see them dreaming of it in their studies by gaslight. A warm, lost world of towering ferns and silent forests, a land where the ancestors of all manner of creatures wandered freely across a basin that was not yet an ocean. There was a melancholy beauty to it, a complete world of life, vanished forever, leaving only fossilized whispers behind in now separated lands. But an idea with the power of a lost continent cannot remain captive in a single discipline. Sclater had built his bridge for lemurs, yet once that bridge was on the map, others began to wonder. Who else might have walked across it? What other, grander journeys could it explain? While Sclater worked quietly in London, a much more flamboyant and influential figure in Germany saw Lemuria and recognized its potential to answer the most profound question of all, the origin of humanity itself. Enter Ernst Haeckel. If Sclater was a meticulous librarian of nature, Haeckel was its passionate, dramatic evangelist. A brilliant biologist, artist, and fierce champion of evolutionary theory, Haeckel was a titan of his age. Yet his thinking was also stained by the prejudices of his time, leading him to construct elaborate and now thoroughly discredited hierarchies of human races. He was a complex, flawed genius, and he was utterly consumed by the search for humanity's missing link. In the 1870s, our fossil record was a yawning emptiness. No ancient ancestors had been unearthed. The question of where we first arose was a complete mystery. Haeckel applied his formidable intellect to the puzzle. He looked at our closest living relatives. Orangutans lived in Asia. Gorillas and chimpanzees lived in Africa. Logically, he reasoned, the birthplace of humanity must lie somewhere between them. A place that had since vanished would also perfectly explain the frustrating lack of bones. He needed a landmass in the Indian Ocean. And there, waiting for him in the pages of a British journal, was Sclater's Lemuria. It was the perfect solution, a scientifically sanctioned ghost in precisely the right location. In his wildly popular book, The History of Creation, Haeckel seized Sclater's idea and expanded its destiny exponentially. Lemuria, he declared, was not merely a pathway for primates. It was the cradle of the human race, our ancestral homeland. He even gave our hypothetical progenitor a name, Pithecanthropus allalis, the speechless ape man. On his maps, he drew Lemuria stretching majestically, and from its heart, he traced the migratory paths of what he considered the 12 different species of humans as they spread to populate the globe. This was the pivotal transformation. With Haeckel's immense authority behind it, Lemuria was reborn. It was no longer a minor footnote in biogeography. It was now a scientific Eden, a paradise lost reimagined for the age of reason. Not a garden made by a deity, but a continent shaped by geology, where our mute, distant ancestors first stood upright and began their long trek toward consciousness. The romance of the lost land deepened into something profoundly personal. The drowning of Lemuria was no longer just the loss of a landmass. It was the loss of our original home, a severance from the very soil where humanity took its first, stumbling steps. Haeckel's intentions were purely scientific, but he could not have known the powerful mythic chord he had struck. He had tapped into that ancient, universal human longing for a forgotten golden age. He had taken a zoologist's phantom and given it the ghost of our own ancestry. The stage was now set. The idea was primed, charged with a significance far beyond fossils and fauna. A theory about a land bridge for small, wide-eyed creatures had become a theory about the lost paradise of humankind itself. The ghost, once built of logic and limestone, was now infused with the spirit of our deepest origin story. And it was ready to be discovered by a new kind of explorer, one who did not need fossils, one for whom the impossible depths of the ocean were no barrier at all. The quiet, rational world of the museum was about to be left behind. We are now going to step into a different atmosphere altogether, one thick with incense, mystery, and a yearning for hidden truths that science seemed unable to provide. The story of Lemuria was about to be taken from the hands of the scientists and delivered into the world of the mystics. Our path now turns sharply, leaving behind the gaslit halls of academia for a world shimmering with a different kind of light. We enter the heady, enigmatic atmosphere of the Victorian esoteric revival. This was an era fascinated with the unseen, a time of seances in darkened parlors, of secret societies, and a profound hunger for a spiritual wisdom that many felt cold, material science had failed to offer. And at the very heart of this swirling movement stood a formidable, chain-smoking Russian aristocrat named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky, or HPB, was a figure of immense charisma and controversy. She claimed to have traveled the globe, studying at the feet of hidden spiritual masters in the remote Himalayas. In 1875, she co-founded the Theosophical Society, dedicated to uncovering humanity's latent psychic powers and the world's secret spiritual truths. She presented herself as a channel for an ancient, timeless wisdom. And in 1888, she published her monumental, labyrinthine masterpiece, The Secret Doctrine. This book, she claimed, was not her own creation, but a commentary on a lost ancient text revealed to her by those hidden masters. Her cosmology was breathtakingly vast. It described the birth and death of universes in immense, repeating cycles. Humanity's journey, in this view, was not a simple biological climb from ape to man. It was a grand spiritual pilgrimage for the soul, unfolding across 7 vast epochs she called the root races. Each race represented a distinct phase in our physical and spiritual evolution, and each required its own continent, its own stage for that act of the cosmic drama. And when Blavatsky needed a stage for her third root race, she reached into the world of science and pulled out Lemuria. She politely credited Philip Sclater for the name, but that is where all similarity ends. She took the label and poured into it a meaning so radically different it was a total reinvention. Theosophy's Lemuria was no mere land bridge. It was a colossal, globe-spanning theater of spiritual evolution, vaster, stranger, and more ancient than any scientist had dared to imagine. It was not just a place, but an era, a state of consciousness, a chapter in the soul's epic. In her hands, the sober geological process of subsidence was replaced by a preordained cosmic plan. She absorbed other legends of lost lands, weaving a grand, unified mythology of sunken continents. The scientists had given her a name and a location. The world she built upon that foundation was entirely her own. The name on the map was the same, but the reality it described was now infinitely stranger, populated by beings that would have staggered the imagination of the sober men who first conceived of a lost land for lemurs. So who, then, were these beings inhabiting Madame Blavatsky's mystical Lemuria? To picture them, we must first imagine their world, which was not our world. According to the secret doctrine, the Earth during the Lemurian epoch was a young, chaotic, and dreamlike planet. The force of gravity was weaker. The atmosphere was a thick, steamy vapor. Matter itself was more fluid, more plastic, less fixed. It was a world still coalescing from a spiritual blueprint into hard physical reality. The creatures that inhabited it were equally fluid, equally strange. They were the third root race, a crucial and monstrous turning point. The first two races were ethereal, ghost-like, mere drafts of humanity. The great experiment was to slowly weave pure spirit into the dense fabric of matter. The Lemurians were the first to wear a physical form, albeit a bizarre one. They were described as gigantic, gelatinous beings. Their bodies lacked solid bones, more like semi-ethereal protoplasm. They were androgynous, both male and female in one body, reproducing through a kind of budding or by laying great eggs. Imagine enormous, soft-bodied giants, perhaps 15 or 18 feet tall, moving with a strange, fluid grace through swampy primeval forests. Their consciousness was as alien as their form. They possessed no sharp, analytical self-awareness. No sense of I. Theirs was a dull, dreamy, instinctual awareness, a psychic receptivity to the world. They were guided by higher spiritual beings, much as a sleepwalking child might be led by a parent. Then, a pivotal event, the separation of the sexes. The hermaphroditic forms split, and humanity became male and female. This was a critical step in the cosmic plan, for it was through this duality that the human intellect could eventually spark into life. But it was also the beginning of attraction, conflict, the world as we know it. Now, recall the ancestor that the scientist Ernst Haeckel had imagined walking his Lemuria. A speechless ape man, a simple biological step from the apes. Compare that to Blavatsky's vision, a race of psychic, egg-laying, gelatinous giants who were born as one gender and split into two. The gulf between the scientific and the esoteric Lemuria becomes a chasm. Haeckel searched for a physical missing link in a chain of biological descent. Blavatsky described a spiritual drama, the incarnation of cosmic intelligence into a monstrous, necessary vessel. One was a story of biology, the other, a story of divinity putting on a coat of flesh. And perhaps their most significant feature was not their size or their reproduction, but their primary organ of perception, a functioning third eye located not in the front, but at the back of the head. This was no physical curiosity. It was the key to their consciousness. In the early days, their two front-facing eyes were not fully developed. Physical sight was secondary. The third eye was an instrument of spiritual and psychic sight. It saw the life force within things, the patterns of energy, the astral plane underlying our own. Through it, they perceived the spiritual hierarchies guiding the planet. They communicated directly through thought. Their reality was a swirling psychic landscape, and the third eye was their compass and connection to the divine. But this state was not meant to last. Humanity's destiny was to develop the mind, the intellect, the ego. And for this to happen, the all-knowing third eye had to fade. Theosophy teaches that as the Lemurians evolved, as their bodies grew denser and their physical sight sharpened, the third eye atrophied. Its spiritual function diminished. It retreated from the surface, sinking deep into the center of the brain, shrinking until all that remained was a tiny, pea-sized kernel of tissue, a vestigial remnant, a souvenir from a forgotten age that every modern human still carries within their skull. This remnant, they claimed, is the pineal gland. It's a breathtaking claim, linking a mystical past directly to our anatomy. And fascinatingly, this tiny gland has long been a mystery. The philosopher René Descartes once called it the seat of the soul. Only recently has science understood its role. It produces melatonin, regulating our sleep-wake cycles. It is, in a very real sense, the gateway to our world of sleep and dreams. In a strange echo, some reptiles still have a light-sensitive parietal eye on their heads, linked to the pineal gland, a rudimentary third eye. So we find a gentle resonance, a mystic story of a lost psychic eye that became the pineal gland, and a scientific discovery that this gland masters our journey into sleep. As the Lemurian spiritual vision faded, their entire epic began to draw to a close. In the grand, cyclical cosmology of theosophy, nothing is permanent. Worlds, like the beings who inhabit them, have their allotted span. They are born, they serve their purpose, and they must die to make way for the next act in the great plan. Lemuria had been the stage for the third root race, the theater for the separation of the sexes and the first full incarnation into dense physical form. But its time was ending. The cosmic clock was striking midnight on an entire epoch, and the Earth itself began to convulse, preparing to wipe the slate clean. The end was not a single, swift catastrophe. It was a long, drawn-out apocalypse, a process of destruction spanning millions of years, written in the two great elemental forces of fire and water. The cataclysm began from below. The crust of the young planet, still thin and volatile, began to crack and rupture. Colossal volcanic chains erupted in concert, tearing the supercontinent apart. Imagine a world where the ground is no longer a certainty, a realm shuddering with perpetual earthquakes, where mountains are thrown up in fiery bursts overnight only to collapse into the sea. Fissures miles long would have vented poisonous gases and rivers of molten lava, incinerating primeval forests, turning regions into black, glassy deserts under a sky choked with ash. The sun would have been a dim red smear. This was a baptism of fire, a planetary purge. As the land fractured, the oceans began their assault. The sinking was no longer the gentle, imperceptible subsidence that 19th century geologists had pictured. It was a violent, chaotic foundering. Massive sections of the continent plunged into the sea, triggering tsunamis of unimaginable scale, waves hundreds of feet high that scoured the remaining lands clean. The thick, vaporous atmosphere, saturated with volcanic dust, released its moisture in torrential, endless downpours. The world was plunged into a boiling, muddy twilight, a battle between the fire of the Earth's core and the fury of its oceans. Most of the later Lemurians, whose spiritual connection had dimmed with their fading third eye, were said to have perished in these cataclysms. They were the humanity that had grown too attached to the physical form, losing their way in the hardening world of matter. But the cosmic plan was one of transition, not annihilation. The spiritual seeds for the next great phase of humanity, the fourth root race, had to be preserved. And so, the stories tell of the elect, the most advanced souls of the Lemurian race, being gathered and saved. Guided by their divine teachers, these small groups of survivors were led away from the heart of the destruction. They were taken to safe, high-altitude lands that would withstand the coming chaos, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of their age, encoded in their very beings. This vision of a violent, cataclysmic end stood in stark contrast to the direction mainstream geology was heading at the time. The scientific world was largely embracing uniformitarianism, the idea that the Earth was shaped by the slow, gradual processes we see today. The age of belief in great, sudden upheavals was mostly past. Blavatsky's apocalyptic descriptions were a deliberate turn away from the gentle, sinking Lemuria of the scientists and a return to the thunderous language of myth and prophecy. Her Lemuria did not die of old age, it was slain. The continent was now shattered and silent beneath the waves. But what happened to the survivors? Blavatsky had painted the epic in the broadest strokes. The finer details of Lemurian culture, its daily life, its very appearance, were a tantalizing void. Filling this spectacular blank fell to the next generation of theosophists. And one of the most influential was a man named William Scott Elliot, a British merchant and devoted follower. In the final years of the 19th century, Scott Elliot published a small but impactful book, The Story of Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. Unlike the charismatic, world-traveling Blavatsky, Scott Elliot presented himself as a humble researcher, a chronicler of a history lost to all but a gifted few. His primary research tool was not the spade of an archaeologist, but the practice of clairvoyant investigation. This was based on the theosophical concept of the Akashic records, a kind of universal, ethereal library said to hold a perfect record of every event that has ever transpired. A trained clairvoyant, it was claimed, could access these records and witness the past directly. Scott Elliot claimed to have done just this, with the help of a more prominent theosophical clairvoyant. Together, they would sit in meditation, projecting their consciousness back to the Lemurian epoch and carefully noting what they saw. Scott Elliot became the scribe for this psychic time travel. The result was a stunning transformation. Blavatsky's abstract cosmic principles were now grounded in a wealth of seemingly concrete detail. His book contained meticulously drawn maps showing the great continent of Lemuria at various stages, though he moved it from the Indian Ocean to a vast expanse covering much of the Pacific. His clairvoyant gaze described the flora and fauna, gigantic tree ferns and flowering plants unknown to modern botany. He described the quality of the air, the light. It was a radical shift in tone. While Blavatsky wrote like a prophet, Scott Elliot wrote with the detached confidence of a Victorian explorer documenting a newly discovered land. He had taken a grand mythological opera and written a detailed anthropological field guide to go with it. This process made the myth tangible. You no longer needed to wrestle with complex spiritual diagrams. You could simply look at a map, read a description of a Lemurian landscape. The ghost continent was being fleshed out, its bones draped with the sensuous details of everyday life. Now that we have met this clairvoyant chronicler, we can step through the portal he claimed to open and take a closer look at the strange, primitive, yet oddly peaceful world he reported, a world of communal living and a startlingly close relationship with the planet's other, giant inhabitants. Stepping through that clairvoyant window, the world William Scott Elliot described is one of profound, alien simplicity. Lemurian society, especially in its earlier phases, was not a civilization as we know it. No cities, no nations, no laws. The very concepts of property, wealth, and social hierarchy had not yet been born. They were a deeply communal people, living in small, scattered groups guided not by kings, but directly by their divine teachers, spiritual beings who had incarnated in Lemurian forms to shepherd the young race. Their guidance was followed with the simple, trusting instinct of a child. Their homes were as simple as their society. They were not great builders of stone. Scott Elliot described dwellings woven from tough grasses and reeds, sometimes reinforced with strands of cooling, fibrous lava. Often, they simply sought shelter in vast networks of caves. Life was a sensory experience of the eternal present. Their days were spent foraging in a dreamlike state, with no art or literature, for their minds did not yet operate on the level of abstract symbolism. And it was their connection to the animal kingdom that produced the most startling images from these psychic chronicles. He described a world teeming with the great reptilian beasts of the Mesozoic era. Plesiosaurs swam in warm, shallow seas. Pterodactyls filled the skies. The jungles were home to dinosaurs. And the giant Lemurians, with their instinctual, non-predatory minds, lived alongside these creatures not in fear, but in a strange harmony. Having no threatening ego, they emitted no sense of danger. Scott Elliot even claimed they kept smaller reptiles as companions and that larger, herbivorous dinosaurs were used as gentle, living guardians for their settlements. This vision of a prehistoric idyll, of giant humanoids living peacefully with dinosaurs, is utterly fantastic. But place it in its historical context. The late 19th century was the height of dinosaur mania. Great fossil discoveries were captivating the public. It seems likely this cultural obsession bled into the psychic visions. Their Lemuria, populated by these celebrity dinosaurs, felt immediate and vivid to a public already primed to imagine a prehistoric world. It was a masterful, if unconscious, blending of ancient occult myth with the very latest scientific wonders. This detailed, storybook portrait became the definitive vision for many. But the Akashic records, it seems, were like any great library. Different readers could come away with different interpretations. Other spiritual explorers would return from the currents of time with slightly different, and in some ways even stranger, tales to tell. Among those other spiritual explorers who claimed to have read the great cosmic library was a formidable Austrian philosopher named Rudolf Steiner. Initially a leading figure in the Theosophical Society, Steiner's own profound clairvoyant research eventually led him to found his own spiritual movement, anthroposophy. He, too, journeyed back to the dawn of humanity. And while he confirmed the existence of a great southern continent and a race called Lemurians, the portrait he painted of their inner life was subtly, yet profoundly, different from Scott Elliott's. Where Scott Elliott's chronicles focused on the external details, communal homes and reptilian companions, Steiner's vision turned inward to the unique quality of Lemurian consciousness. For Steiner, the defining characteristic was not simplicity, but an immense and powerful will. The Lemurians he described were not passive, childlike beings. They were masters of a raw, primal force of volition that modern humanity has almost entirely lost. He taught that the Lemurians did not need technology or tools because their will could interact directly with the forces of nature. By focusing their intent, they could influence the growth of plants, encouraging them to grow faster or larger to provide food. They could, to some extent, calm the winds or shape the weather. Their will was a tangible force, a power that could mold the world around them. To complement this incredible power, Steiner described an equally incredible deficiency. The Lemurians, he claimed, had no memory as we understand it. They lived in a state of perpetual present. Each sunrise brought a world that was entirely new. An action performed one day was not remembered the next. They could not learn from past experiences by reflecting on them. Imagine waking every single day with no recollection of the days before. Your life, a series of disconnected but vivid moments. For Steiner, this was a necessary phase, a consciousness of pure, unreflective being before the intellect was developed, before humanity became burdened by the weight of its own history. This powerful will was reflected in their physical forms. Steiner described their skeletons as not yet hard and rigid, but more pliable and cartilaginous. Their bodies were less fixed, more directly expressive of their inner state. Their will could shape not only the world around them but the very form and function of their own flesh. This creates a fascinatingly different picture. The Lemuria of Scott Elliott is a peaceful prehistoric idyll, a world of gentle giants in simple harmony with nature. The Lemuria of Rudolf Steiner is a far more dynamic and volatile world, a place of immense psychic power wielded by beings who are more like forces of nature themselves. One is the story of primal innocence, the other, a story of primal power. One race coexisted with the beasts of their world, the other commanded the very elements of it. Yet despite these striking differences in their clairvoyant reports, the fundamental story arc remained the same. Both traditions agreed this strange and powerful race existed, that their consciousness was profoundly alien to our own, and that their epic was brought to an end by great cataclysms. And most importantly, both agreed the story did not end with the sinking. The end of Lemuria was not the end of humanity, but merely the end of a chapter. The most advanced souls, those who had best fulfilled the evolutionary purpose of their age, were preserved. They survived the destruction, carrying the torch of consciousness forward, destined to become the seeds of the next great civilization to rise from the waves. The legendary continent of Atlantis. As the fires of the Earth's core consumed the great continent and the oceans rushed in to claim the ruins, the story of the Lemurians was transformed into one of survival, a mythic exodus that forms a bridge between two lost worlds. This was not a panicked flight of terrified refugees. According to the esoteric histories, it was a deliberate, divinely orchestrated migration, a planned preservation of the evolutionary harvest. The cosmic curriculum required that the most advanced souls be carried forward to begin the next lesson. The saviors and guides in this great transition were once again the spiritual masters. As the cataclysms began, these guides identified the small groups of Lemurians who were spiritually prepared for the next stage. These were the souls in whom the nascent spark of intellect was beginning to glow, in whom the primal will had been refined, not corrupted. A call, a psychic summons they understood with their entire being, drew them away from the crumbling heart of the continent towards safer lands. They were the living ark, the vessel carrying the sacred genetic and spiritual inheritance of their race. Their journey was an epic trek across a world in flux, a planet still racked with geological growing pains. They traveled over lands that were themselves rising from the sea, their path illuminated by an inner light of divine guidance. They did not know their destination, for they lacked the memory or foresight to form such a concept. But they moved with the unerring certainty of migrating birds following an ancient, invisible map. They were led to a vast new landmass rising in the Atlantic Ocean, a fresh continent with a different energy, a clean slate. This was the land that would become Atlantis. Here, on the shores of this new world, the Lemurian survivors became the seed of the fourth root race, the Atlanteans. They were the Adams and Eves of a new humanity. Their children, born under a different sky, would be a new people. The dominant traits of the Lemurian age, the dreamy instinct, the lack of memory, the powerful psychic will, slowly receded, becoming the dormant subconscious of the human psyche. In their place, the faculty of memory began to blossom. The intellect, the ability to reason and connect cause and effect, awakened. The Atlanteans were to be the race of the mind, just as the Lemurians had been the race of the will. The survivors were the vital bridge, their bodies and souls the raw material from which a more complex, self-aware humanity could be forged. This story of a world-destroying cataclysm and a small group of chosen survivors is a powerful, recurring theme in the myths of nearly every culture on Earth. The story of Noah's Ark, the tale of Manu in Hindu scripture, the Greek myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha, all echo this pattern. The theosophical narrative of the Lemurian migration is an esoteric version of this universal archetype, a story of a great ending and a precious new beginning. The legacy of Lemuria, therefore, was not one of ruins at the bottom of the sea, but of a living impulse carried forward. The lost continent did not truly vanish. It was absorbed. Its essence became the foundation for the glories and tragedies of Atlantis. This succession from Lemuria to Atlantis formed the central highway of human evolution in the esoteric story. But back in the vast waters of the Pacific, where Lemuria had once lain in these new mystical maps, another similar ghost was beginning to stir. A rival continent with a different name and a different chronicler, whose story would become forever entangled with the one we have been following. While the Theosophists traced the lineage of their Lemurian survivors to the shores of Atlantis, a new and potent myth was taking shape in the waters of the Pacific. This was the story of a rival lost motherland, with a different name, a different nature, and a different creator. Its name was Mu, and its chief evangelist was a retired British-American Army colonel, inventor, and writer named James Churchward. Churchward published his famous book, The Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man, in 1926, long after the core theosophical ideas were established. His tale of discovery was a romantic adventure in itself. He claimed that while serving as a soldier in India in the late 19th century, he befriended a high-ranking temple priest who, after much persuasion, showed him a set of ancient, secret tablets written in a forgotten language. These Nakal tablets, Churchward said, told the complete history of a great motherland of humanity. He spent years deciphering them, he explained, and his books were the result. To this day, no evidence of these tablets has ever been found outside of Churchward's own accounts. The civilization he described was radically different from the Theosophists' primitive Lemuria. Churchward's Mu was a magnificent, sun-drenched paradise, a vast continent stretching from Hawaii to Easter Island. It was, he claimed, a highly advanced civilization that flourished some 50,000 years ago, home to 64 million people living under a single, benevolent government led by a priest-emperor called the Ra Mu. This was not a world of primal chaos. but a global utopia of peace and prosperity, the original Garden of Eden on Earth. The inhabitants of Mu were not transitional, ape-like beings. They were anatomically modern humans, spiritually and technologically advanced, living in beautiful cities connected by smooth, paved roads. For Churchward, Mu was the single cradle of all the world's great ancient civilizations. He argued that Egypt, India, the Maya, and the cultures of ancient Greece and Babylon were not independent developments, but were all colonies or refugee settlements from the great motherland of Mu. He spent much of his life trying to prove this, gathering what he believed was evidence of Mu's influence in symbols, architecture, and myths from cultures around the globe. Like Lemuria, Mu was destined for a cataclysmic end. But Churchward's explanation was uniquely his own. He proposed the continent was built upon a network of immense, hollow caverns filled with highly pressurized volcanic gas. A series of earthquakes and eruptions eventually caused these gas chambers to collapse, and the entire continent buckled like a dinner plate, plunging 64 million people into a watery grave in a single, terrifying event. The scattered islands of Polynesia, he claimed, are the last pathetic remnants, the mountain peaks of a once great, now drowned world. By the early 20th century, two ghost continents now haunted the Pacific. Though very different, their stories began to blur in the public imagination. Lemuria was ancient and primitive, an evolutionary stage. Mu was more recent and utopian, a lost golden age. Lemuria's story was built collaboratively over decades, beginning with science. Mu's story sprang fully formed from a single author. Yet the similarities were too great to keep them separate. Both were vast lands in the Pacific. Both were considered a motherland of humanity. Both were destroyed spectacularly. For many, the names Lemuria and Mu became interchangeable labels for a single, powerful idea: a lost paradise beneath the waves. This rich, tangled mythology of sunken worlds created a fascinating, mysterious backdrop, a shared literary universe just waiting for a new kind of storyteller to populate it with heroes, gods, and monsters. Our narrative now moves from the seance parlor to the pages of pulp magazines, the inexpensive, wildly popular fiction publications exploding with tales of adventure, horror, and fantasy. Here, the lost continent was about to be reimagined once more, this time by a reclusive gentleman from Providence, Rhode Island. His name was Howard Phillips Lovecraft, a master of a genre he largely pioneered, cosmic horror. Lovecraft was a voracious reader of history, mythology, and the very same esoteric and pseudo-historical works that gave us Lemuria and Atlantis. But where the Theosophists saw a grand, benevolent plan of spiritual evolution, Lovecraft saw only a terrifying, purposeless void. He took the building blocks of the mystic's worldview and used them to construct a universe of soul-shattering dread. The central tenet of Lovecraft's cosmic horror is this: humanity is a fleeting, insignificant accident in a universe that is ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent. The true masters of the cosmos are alien beings of unimaginable power, the great old ones and outer gods, who slumber in dark spaces between the stars or in sunken cities. They are not evil in a human sense. They are simply so far beyond us that our lives and civilizations are as meaningless as an ant colony to a passing human. The greatest horror is a glimpse of this terrible truth. He seized upon the idea of lost continents and pre-human races and twisted it to his own terrifying purpose. Theosophy's root races, our spiritual ancestors, became Lovecraft's alien colonizers. In his Cthulhu mythos, Earth's history is a catalog of alien civilizations. The Elder Things, the Migo, the great race of Yith, who lived, built colossal cities, and waged cosmic wars on this planet for eons before the first human evolved. The benevolent spiritual guides of Blavatsky's vision were transformed into monstrous, tentacled gods like the dreaded Cthulhu, who waits, dead but dreaming, in his drowned city of Relia. Lemuria, in this context, is just a name on a very old and bloody map. It is no longer the cradle of humanity, but perhaps a forgotten colony of one of these alien species, a battleground in a war that ended millions of years before our story began. Its sinking was not a cosmic reset for our benefit, but meaningless collateral damage in a conflict beyond our comprehension. The theosophical concept of the Akashic records is darkly mirrored in stories where alien beings project their minds across time to access all knowledge, not for enlightenment, but for cold, intellectual purposes. Lovecraft effectively deromanticized the myth. The bittersweet nostalgia for a sunken paradise was replaced with chilling dread. The existence of a place like Lemuria was no longer a hint of a glorious past, but terrifying evidence that we are not the first, nor the most important, inhabitants of our own world. The ruins at the bottom of the sea were not a promise of lost wisdom, but a warning of powers that could erase a continent as easily as a child kicks over a sandcastle. He was not alone in this pulp fiction excavation. From the same circle of writers and correspondents, another powerful imagination was at work, drawing from the same well of myth. But this writer would take these ingredients and bake a very different kind of story, one filled not with creeping dread, but with mighty-thewed heroes and thunderous adventure. From the same orbit of correspondence and fellow dreamers that included H.P. Lovecraft, another brilliant, troubled imagination was at work. This was the prolific Texan writer, Robert E. Howard. Where Lovecraft looked into the abyss of a lost past and saw creeping cosmic terror, Howard saw a stage for thundering, red-blooded heroism. He took the concept of a forgotten age, populated it with barbarians, sorcerers, and forgotten gods, and in doing so, created an entire genre, sword and sorcery. His greatest hero, Conan the Cimmerian, would walk a world built upon the ruins of Lemuria. Howard's genius lay in the creation of his setting, the Hyborian Age. He laid out its history in a detailed essay, crafting a fictional epic set in what he called an age undreamed of. He cleverly placed this era in a gap in our own history, after the sinking of Atlantis, but before the rise of ancient civilizations like Egypt and Sumer. This gave him the freedom to create his own kingdoms and cultures while still tethering his world to a mythic, pseudo-historical reality. His Hyborian Age was a brutal, vibrant, and dangerous place of high adventure and dark magic, and it had its own deep history, stretching back into the cataclysms that had reshaped the globe. In this fictional history, Lemuria plays a crucial, if ancient, role. Howard envisioned it not as a great continent, but as a vast chain of volcanic islands in the Eastern Ocean. In the time of Atlantis, these islands were ruled by a strange, ancient, and cruel civilization. The human inhabitants were their downtrodden slaves. When the great cataclysm struck, sinking Atlantis and shaking the world, these Lemurian slaves rose in a bloody, savage rebellion, slaughtering their masters. After a long and brutal war, they fled the sinking islands, escaping to the eastern coast of the main Thurian continent. There, stripped of all civilization, they devolved into a state of stark barbarism, living for thousands of years as ape-like savages. The main adventures of Conan the Barbarian are set many millennia after these events. But the savage Lemurian survivors are the distant ancestral seed from which some of the peoples of Conan's world have sprung. The name Lemuria itself is a forgotten whisper, a land that existed in an age even before the age undreamed of. Its inclusion gives Howard's world an immense sense of time scale. The ruins Conan stumbles upon are not the first ruins. His age is not the first age. Civilizations have risen and fallen countless times. The memory of Lemuria is the bedrock of his world's savagery, a hint of a past so deep and brutal it makes the Hyborian Age seem civilized by comparison. Here we see a vision of Lemuria, a world away from both the Theosophists and Lovecraft. Howard's Lemurians were not a spiritual root race on a journey to enlightenment. They were brutalized slaves who became savage survivors. Their story is not one of spiritual evolution, but of a desperate, bloody struggle for freedom. And unlike in Lovecraft's fiction, this ancient, monstrous past does not induce cosmic hopelessness. Howard's world, for all its dark sorcery, is a place where a determined individual can triumph. The horrors are tangible things to be fought with a sword and overcome with courage. The past is not a source of madness, but a source of adventure, a tomb to be explored, a monster to be slain. The focus is on the power and indomitable will of the human hero. Together, Lovecraft and Howard, friends and correspondents, took the idea of the lost continent and split it down two distinct paths that would define fantasy and horror for the rest of the century. They had fully transformed a scientific hypothesis and a spiritual doctrine into a literary playground. But just as it seemed Lemuria had been safely confined to the realm of fiction, a new and deeply strange story would emerge from the pages of a different pulp magazine. It was a story that claimed to be entirely true, a terrifying account that would drag the legend out of the distant past and place it in a hidden world, right beneath our very feet. The journey had taken Lemuria from a scientific theory to a spiritual stage, then into the fictional realms of cosmic horror and heroic fantasy. It seemed the legend had found its final resting place as useful literary furniture. But in the mid-1940s, the story took a bizarre and unsettling turn, lurching from fiction into what was presented as terrifying contemporary fact. This new chapter began not with a mystic or a novelist, but with a welder from Pennsylvania named Richard Sharp Shaver, and it played out in the pages of the popular science fiction pulp magazine, Amazing Stories. The magazine's editor, Ray Palmer, had a keen eye for the sensational. In 1943, he received a letter from Shaver, who claimed to have discovered an ancient language that was the source of all human tongues. Intrigued, Palmer encouraged him to write more. Shaver responded with a massive manuscript titled A Warning to Future Man. Palmer heavily rewrote and expanded it, retitling it I Remember Lemuria, and published it in the March 1945 issue. He presented it not as straightforward fiction, but as something more, a true story, remembered by Shaver, and embellished only for dramatic effect. The public reaction was explosive and unprecedented. Shaver's tale was a dark, paranoid inversion of everything that had come before. He claimed that billions of years ago, Earth was ruled by a race of godlike giants, the Titans, from another star system. These were the true ancestors, later remembered as Atlanteans and Lemurians. They were masters of incredible technology, but a catastrophic event occurred. Their sun began emitting deadly radiation. To survive, the entire race abandoned the surface, building a new, technologically advanced paradise in vast hollow caverns deep within the Earth. For a time, they thrived. But the lingering poisonous rays slowly affected them. Most of the race degenerated. Their minds warped, their bodies becoming stunted and grotesque. They became the Darrows, an acronym for detrimental robots. Shaver described them as a race of sadistic morons living in the ruins of their ancestors' great cities, playing with advanced technology they no longer understood. Chief among these technologies were rays that could project thoughts, cause pain, and manipulate matter from a distance. These Darrows, Shaver claimed, were the source of all evil and suffering on the surface world. They used their rays to cause accidents, start arguments, inflict diseases, and whisper thoughts of madness into the minds of unsuspecting people. Shoddy construction, a sudden illness, a flash of inexplicable rage, all were the work of the Darrows. Shaver's knowledge, he insisted, came from direct experience. He claimed to hear their voices in his head, that they were actively tormenting him with their rays. A process he said began when his welding gun somehow opened a telepathic channel to their cavern world. A small, heroic minority of the ancient race, the Darrows, integrative robots, were still fighting a losing battle against the Darrows in the deep caverns. But humanity on the surface was effectively helpless prey. The story struck a nerve in post-war America. The circulation of amazing stories skyrocketed. The magazine was flooded with thousands of letters from readers who claimed Shaver's story was true. They, too, had heard the voices from underground. They had been tormented by strange rays. They had vague, nightmarish memories of life in the caverns. The Shaver mystery became a cultural phenomenon, a sort of crowdsourced paranoid delusion. Whether Shaver was a genuine psychic, a clever hoaxer, or a man suffering from profound mental illness, and whether Palmer was a true believer or a brilliant opportunist, remains debated. But the effect was to drag the myth of Lemuria into the modern age, transforming it from a nostalgic story of a lost paradise into a terrifying, conspiratorial threat lurking just below our sidewalks. While this dark, claustrophobic vision of degenerate Lemurians festering deep within the earth captured a certain public imagination, a completely different story was taking root on the sunlit slopes of a sacred mountain in Northern California. A story of Lemurian survivors who were not monsters, but enlightened masters. As the paranoid fantasy of the Shaver mystery played out in pulp magazines, a new and opposite vision of Lemuria's legacy was quietly flourishing on the sun-drenched surface of the world. The focus was a real and breathtakingly beautiful place, Mount Shasta, a magnificent dormant volcano that rises in solitary splendor from the forests of Northern California. A place of profound natural beauty, its peak often wreathed in strange, lens-shaped clouds. Mount Shasta has long been a sacred site for Native American tribes and a beacon for spiritual seekers. In the 20th century, it became the heart of the modern New Age revival of the Lemurian myth. While Richard Shaver described a subterranean world of horror, a new story was being told of a hidden city of light, peace, and immense wisdom existing deep within the hollowed-out interior of Mount Shasta. The city's name is Telos, a Greek word for purpose or goal, and its inhabitants, the story goes, are the direct descendants of the survivors of the Lemurian cataclysm. Far from being degenerate monsters, the Lemurians of Telos are described as beings of incredible grace and beauty. They are tall, elegant, and effectively immortal, having preserved the advanced spiritual science of their lost motherland. Their city is a marvel of crystal architecture, powered by clean, free energy, where disease, aging, and conflict have been eliminated. This is the utopian dream of Lemuria made manifest. The masters of Telos are not our tormentors. They are our elder siblings, our spiritual guardians. They are said to be members of a great galactic brotherhood, working tirelessly on a spiritual level to guide the evolution of surface humanity. They remain hidden, the legend says, because we are not yet ready for their teachings. Our warlike, spiritually immature civilization would only misunderstand and corrupt their message of peace and universal love. And so they wait, tending to the sacred energies of the planet from their crystal city, occasionally sending out emissaries in cloaked vehicles sometimes glimpsed as strange lights on the mountain, mistaken for UFOs. Here we have a perfect, beautiful polarity, a tale of two subterranean worlds. The Shaver mystery gave us a Lemurian legacy of darkness, a vision born from fear and paranoia where our ancestors became our tormentors. The Mount Shasta legend offers a legacy of light, a vision born of hope and spiritual yearning where our ancestors are our saviors. One describes a hellish prison of decaying technology, the other, a pristine paradise. One uses mysterious rays to cause pain and madness. The other uses the healing vibrations of crystals and sound. It is as if the entire Lemurian myth had split into its own subconscious and superconscious, its shadow and its light. This peaceful, hopeful vision was solidified and popularized in the 1930s by Harvey Spencer Lewis, founder of the Rosicrucian order, Amorc. He wrote and spoke extensively about the secret community of mystics living on or within Mount Shasta, explicitly identifying them as descendants of Lemurian survivors. His work helped cement the mountain as the capital city of the lost continent in the minds of a generation of spiritual seekers. The legend continues to grow and evolve to this day, with channelers, healers, and spiritual tourists flocking to the mountain, hoping to make contact with the benevolent masters of Telos. But this powerful vision of a crystal city filled with wise Lemurians did not simply appear in the 1930s. Its strange and prophetic seeds were planted much earlier, decades before, in the 19th century. The idea of a hidden, advanced civilization connected to Mount Shasta was first introduced to the world in a remarkable and mysterious book, channeled by a young man who claimed he was merely a scribe for a soul who had lived in a lost world. The beautiful vision of a crystal city did not spring from nowhere. Its origins can be traced back to a single, deeply influential book that emerged from the shadow of the mountain itself in the late 19th century. The book was titled A Dweller on Two Planets, and its credited author was a spirit named Philos the Tibetan. The hand that wrote the words, however, belonged to a young man from Wairika, California, named Frederick Spencer Oliver. The story of the book's creation is a mystery. In 1883, Oliver, then a teenager, found his hand being guided by an unseen intelligence. Over several years, in a process of automatic writing, he filled hundreds of pages with a dense, complex narrative he claimed was not his own. He was merely an amanuensis, a scribe taking dictation from Philos, a soul wishing to share his past incarnations. The book was finished in 1886. Though Oliver died young, his mother ensured its posthumous publication, and it has remained an underground classic. The book is the grand autobiography of Philos, focusing on a life he lived in Atlantis, where his name was Zaelm. The Atlantis he describes is a civilization of breathtaking technological and spiritual advancement, a world of silent, electric-powered airships, devices that transmit moving pictures and sound, and a society that mastered the subtle forces of nature. It reads like Jules Verne-infused science fiction but is layered with esoteric spirituality, reincarnation, and karma. The most crucial part for our story is the direct connection to Mount Shasta. In the narrative, Philos travels from Atlantis to a magnificent spiritual retreat and repository of ancient knowledge located deep within the mountain. The book describes, for the very first time, a hidden city inside Shasta, a place of stunning temples, great libraries, and advanced technology, a secret colony of the Atlantean Empire. This is the literary genesis of Telos, the blueprint for the Crystal City. And where did these advanced Atlanteans come from? The book is explicit. They were the descendants of a much older, wiser, and more peaceful race that inhabited a great motherland which had sunk beneath the waves long before. The book names this motherland Lemuria. So here, in this strange channeled text from 1884, is the first complete articulation of the lineage that would define the modern myth. The ancient, wise race of Lemuria gave birth to the technologically advanced civilization of Atlantis, and a secret remnant of that Atlantean wisdom was preserved in a hidden city inside Mount Shasta. A Dweller on Two Planets became a foundational text for California's burgeoning metaphysical culture. It provided the missing link, the geographical anchor the theosophical story had lacked. It took the abstract global story of root races and lost continents and gave it a specific, local, deeply sacred address. The wisdom of Lemuria was no longer just a story in a book. It was a living presence waiting inside a real mountain you could visit. This idea of a hidden archive, a spiritual database encoded into the mountain, would continue to evolve, eventually transforming into a new and very tangible concept. The idea that this ancient knowledge could be found not just in a place, but within a thing, a special kind of crystal you could hold in the palm of your hand. The idea of a great repository of ancient knowledge, a library of a lost world, had been central to the Lemurian myth from the beginning. For Madame Blavatsky, it was the ethereal Akashic records. For followers of the Mount Shasta legend, it was the physical city of Telos. But in the late 20th century, this concept evolved once more, becoming something far more personal and tangible. The Great Library of Lemuria was, in a sense, miniaturized, transformed into an object you could hold. This was the birth of the belief in Lemurian seed crystals. This new chapter began not in an ancient text, but in the world of modern crystal healing and New Age spirituality. The origin story is typically traced to the late 1990s, to the mineral-rich Diamantina region of Brazil. Miners there were said to have discovered a unique deposit of quartz crystals. They were long, slender points, remarkably clear. But what made them distinct was that instead of growing in a cluster, many were found lying separately in sand, as if placed there individually. And running up their sides were distinctive horizontal grooves or lines, like a ladder or a barcode. From this discovery, a beautiful and compelling new piece of lore was born. These were not ordinary crystals, the story went. They were the seed crystals of the Lemurian civilization. The narrative holds that in the final days of Lemuria, As the continent faced imminent destruction, the most spiritually advanced Lemurians sought to preserve their culture's greatest treasure, its consciousness, its wisdom, its message of love and unity. They programmed these special quartz crystals with this knowledge, encoding their entire history and spiritual teachings into the crystal's molecular structure. They then planted these seeds of consciousness in various locations around the globe, burying them in the earth where they would lie dormant, waiting for a future humanity to reach a sufficient level of spiritual awareness to find them and use them. The distinctive striations are seen as the key to unlocking this ancient data. They are not just a geological feature, but a kind of spiritual braille, a tactile filing system. The belief is that by entering a meditative state and gently running a finger over these lines, a person can activate the crystal and download the information stored within. This is often described not as seeing images or hearing words, but as an intuitive download, a sudden insight, a feeling of deep peace, a sense of connection to a loving, ancient intelligence. These crystals are therefore not seen as mere tools, but as living, conscious beings, a direct link to the masters of the lost civilization. They are considered powerful instruments for personal healing and planetary awakening. The wisdom they contain is said to be about balance, unconditional love, and the essential unity of all life. They represent the full flowering of the gentle, utopian vision of Lemuria that began on the slopes of Mount Shasta. This development made the legend more personal and accessible than ever before. You no longer needed to be a trained clairvoyant or a pilgrim to a sacred mountain to make contact with the lost world. The wisdom of the ancients was now available for purchase in a metaphysical bookstore. It was a democratization of the myth, placing a fragment of the sunken paradise directly into the hands of the individual seeker. For many believers, these crystals are more than passive hard drives. They are seen as communication devices, energetic tuning forks that can attune a person's consciousness to the very beings who created them, opening a direct channel. This idea leads us to the final flowering of the modern Lemurian myth, the practice of channeling. In its simplest sense, channeling is the belief that a person can act as a vessel for a non-physical consciousness, allowing that being to speak or write through them. This practice has deep roots in the 19th century spiritualist movement. In a way, both Blavatsky and Frederick Spencer Oliver were early pioneers. But in the late 20th and 21st centuries, the practice evolved. The beings being channeled were often described as angels, extraterrestrials, higher dimensional beings, or, as in our story, the ascended masters of lost civilizations. The Lemurian beings who speak through modern channelers are a universe away from Blavatsky's giants or Howard's savage slaves. They are consistently portrayed as profoundly benevolent, wise, and loving guides. Often, they are given names and personalities. The most famous is Adama, the purported high priest of the subterranean city of Telos. Through various channelers across the globe, Adama and other Lemurian masters deliver messages of hope, encouragement, and gentle guidance for a world in turmoil. The core of the channeled Lemurian message is almost always one of unconditional love and the essential oneness of all creation. They speak of a coming great shift in consciousness for humanity, a planetary ascension into a higher dimension of being, a new golden age of peace and enlightenment. Their teachings encourage a return to a more heart-centered way of life, urging people to release fear, judgment, and materialism. They often speak on ecological themes, pleading for a return to a harmonious relationship with the natural world, just as they themselves lived in their lost paradise. A central concept is the idea of reawakening the Lemurian heart within each of us. This is the memory of our ancient shared heritage, a time when humanity was more intuitive, psychically open, and lived from love rather than intellect-driven fear. The goal is not to physically rebuild Lemuria, but to resurrect its consciousness here and now. Once again, we see that stark polarity in the modern myth. Consider the terrifying voices Shaver claimed to hear, the malevolent whispers of the subterranean Daros. Now, compare that to the gentle, loving guidance of an Adama of Telos. It is the same fundamental idea, communication with the descendants of a lost race. but one path leads to a paranoid nightmare, and the other to a serene and hopeful dream. For those who follow these teachings, Lemuria has completed its long journey. It is no longer a lost continent to be found on a map. It has become a living, interactive source of spiritual guidance, a state of consciousness to be cultivated. While this beautiful spiritual evolution was taking place, the older, more fantastical versions of Lemuria continue to thrive in a very different sphere, not as a source of wisdom, but as a source of wonder and adventure in popular entertainment. Here, stripped of complex doctrines, the name Lemuria took on a new life as a powerful piece of shorthand, a single word that could instantly conjure a world of fantasy, mystery, and ancient wonder. Nowhere is this cultural absorption more apparent than in the world of video games, particularly in Japanese role-playing games, or JRPGs. Here, the trope of the lost, ancient, magically advanced civilization is a cornerstone. Time and again, players exploring a fantasy world will stumble upon the ruins of, or perhaps a still-living remnant of, a civilization named Lemuria. This in-game Lemuria is almost always breathtakingly beautiful. Its aesthetic is one of flowing water, shimmering crystals, and elegant, often Greco-Roman inspired architecture. It is a world of light, magic, and peace, a stark contrast to the gritty, war-torn lands of the game's present day. Its people are wise, gentle, and magically gifted, and their story is inevitably one of tragedy, a great cataclysm, a magical disaster, or a slow decline that led to their disappearance, leaving behind only powerful artifacts and a lingering sense of melancholy beauty. The name itself has become a floating symbol, detached from its original contexts. A game designer doesn't need to have read Madame Blavatsky to use it effectively. The name alone does the work. It has absorbed over a century of associations, and simply hearing Lemuria triggers a set of expectations in the player. You are about to discover a place of ancient magic, lost secrets, and profound beauty. It has become a reliable, beloved piece of world building, a fantasy brand name for a lost, aquatic utopia. This cultural osmosis extends into other media. You find the name used by bands across genres, from indie rock to heavy metal, chosen to evoke a sense of mystery, timelessness, and connection to something deeper. It appears in album and song titles as a poetic reference to a lost golden age. In the sprawling universes of comic books, Lemuria appears on the map as a physical place, often a rival kingdom to Atlantis, home to a strange race of sea dwellers. In modern fantasy novels and manga, it is a name that can be dropped to add a sense of deep history, a hint of ages and empires that rose and fell long before the story's beginning. These modern interpretations often echo the many lives the myth has already lived. The peaceful, magically attuned Lemuria of a video game is a direct, secular descendant of the serene spiritual vision from Mount Shasta. A story that portrays Lemuria as the home of a monstrous ancient evil is channeling the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft. A tale featuring savage, sea-roving Lemurian warriors borrows a page from Robert E. Howard. Popular culture has become a great buffet of the myth, with creators picking and choosing the flavors that best suit their stories. And so, Lemuria has achieved a kind of immortality its original proponents could never have imagined. It has become a successful, enduring brand in the marketplace of fantasy. But while the name was taking on this vibrant, imaginative life, the original scientific question that spawned the entire legend, that quiet, frustrating riddle of the lemurs, was also on a journey. The world of real-world geology was undergoing a slow, profound revolution throughout the 20th century. A change that would eventually offer a new, and in its own way even more incredible, explanation for that old puzzle. This revolution would once and for all sink the lost continent of Lemuria without a single drop of water. While the legend flourished in mysticism and entertainment, the quiet world of science was making its way toward the real solution. The story of Lemuria began, remember, with a simple biological observation that could not be explained by the geology of the day. Its scientific end would come when geology finally caught up, offering an explanation so radical it would make the idea of a sunken land bridge seem quaint. This was the tectonic revolution, a shift in our understanding of the planet as fundamental as the Copernican revolution was for the cosmos. The first whispers came in the early 20th century from a German meteorologist and polar explorer named Alfred Wegener. Looking at a map, he was struck by the uncanny jigsaw puzzle fit between the coastlines of South America and Africa. What if it wasn't a coincidence? What if these continents had once been joined and had somehow, impossibly, drifted apart? He called his idea continental drift. He spent years gathering evidence, fossils of the same land-dwelling reptiles and ancient ferns on now-separated continents, mountain ranges that matched up perfectly across the Atlantic as if a single chain had been torn in two. He proposed that continents were rafts of lighter rock, slowly plowing their way across the globe. But for half a century, Wegener's theory was largely dismissed and ridiculed. The primary objection was simple: what force could possibly be powerful enough to move an entire continent? The idea seemed physically impossible. So the old geology, the world of a contracting Earth where land could only move up and down, remained dominant. The respectable ghosts of land bridges and sunken continents like Lemuria continued to be the accepted explanation. The vindication for Wegener's beautiful idea would have to wait until after his death. The proof would come from the very place no one had been able to properly study, the bottom of the ocean. In the 1950s and 60s, using sonar technology developed during World War II, scientists began to map the ocean floor in detail for the first time. They discovered something astonishing: a vast underwater mountain range running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean. This mid-Atlantic ridge was a massive volcanic seam, a place where magma from deep within the Earth was constantly rising up, creating new oceanic crust and pushing the older crust outwards in both directions. This was the discovery of seafloor spreading. The engine Wegener had been missing. The final, undeniable proof came from studying the Earth's magnetic field. As volcanic rock cools, its iron-bearing minerals align with the planet's magnetic field. Scientists found the ocean floor was covered in a perfectly symmetrical pattern of magnetic stripes, showing where the Earth's magnetic poles had reversed over millions of years. This pattern was a perfect tape recording of the seafloor spreading over eons. The continents weren't plowing through the ocean floor. The ocean floor itself was a giant conveyor belt carrying the continents along with it. This new, unified theory of plate tectonics completely rewrote the book on geology. The Earth was not a cooling, shrinking apple. It was a dynamic, living planet with a churning interior that constantly rearranged its own surface. And with this new understanding, the riddle of the lemurs was finally solved. There was no need for a lost continent in the Indian Ocean. The solution was far more elegant. India, Madagascar, and Africa had once been next-door neighbors, part of a single, colossal landmass. They had since drifted apart, carrying their shared cargo of flora and fauna with them. The scientific ghost of Lemuria was finally laid to rest, its purpose fulfilled, its existence no longer required. It was replaced not by a void, but by the scientifically proven reality of a real supercontinent. A lost world even grander than the one Sclater had imagined. The theory of plate tectonics did not just erase the need for Lemuria. It replaced the phantom continent with a real one, a lost world whose scale and history were more epic than anything the mystics had ever dreamed. Its name was Gondwana. And it is in the true story of this great southern supercontinent that we find the final, elegant answer to the riddle that began our entire journey. To imagine Gondwana, you must rewind Earth's history not by thousands, but by hundreds of millions of years. You must watch the oceans shrink and the continents slide back together in a slow, majestic reverse dance. In this ancient world, the lands we know as South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Arabian Peninsula were all fused into a single, colossal landmass. Imagine a coastline where the shores of India nestled against Antarctica, where Africa was connected to South America, and where Madagascar was tucked firmly against the coast of what would one day become Kenya. This was Gondwana, a world of vast, warm inland seas and strange primeval forests, existing for an almost unimaginably long time. But the engine of plate tectonics is relentless. Beginning around 180 million years ago, in the age of the dinosaurs, this great supercontinent began to feel the strain from the churning mantle below. Great rift valleys formed, and the land began to tear apart. The process was incredibly slow, a continental sundering that took tens of millions of years. First, it split into two major pieces. Then, those pieces continued to fracture. India broke away from Antarctica and began its long, lonely, and surprisingly rapid journey north across a newly forming Indian Ocean. Australia and Antarctica clung together a while longer before parting. Africa and South America slowly pivoted away from each other, opening the South Atlantic like a giant, closing fan. And here, in this slow, planetary ballet, is the solution to Philip Sclater's old puzzle. The early ancestors of lemurs and their primate relatives evolved at a time when these landmasses were either still connected or much, much closer together. They did not need a land bridge to cross an ocean because the ocean, as we know it, did not yet fully exist. They simply walked. They spread out across the contiguous forests of Gondwana. Then, as the continents drifted apart, these once connected populations became isolated. The group that ended up on the island of Madagascar, which had split from Africa, found itself in a unique evolutionary paradise with few predators and little competition. They diversified into the myriad forms we see today. Their relatives, carried along with India and Africa, faced a different fate, competing with other evolving primates. The strange distribution of their fossils is not the ghost of a sunken continent, but the true, fossilized footprint of a drifting one. There is a beautiful historical irony in all this. The name for this real supercontinent, Gondwana, was first coined in the 19th century by the Austrian geologist Eduard Suess, the very man we met earlier. But he coined it to describe his own land bridge theory, a system of sunken connections to explain fossil distribution. Science eventually discarded his mechanism but kept his name for the real, drifting supercontinent. The name itself is a ghost, a fossil of the old, incorrect idea, now attached to the new and correct one. The truth, in this case, is arguably more wondrous than the myth it replaced. It is a story not of a single catastrophic sinking, but of a slow, inevitable continental dance that has been ongoing for billions of years and continues to this day. It is a story written in the magnetic stripes of the ocean floor and the fossil records of now distant lands. The scientific mystery of Lemuria is solved, and yet the myth persists. If science has provided such a complete and beautiful answer, why do we still find ourselves drawn to the story of a lost, sunken world? If the scientific ghost has been laid to rest, why does the spiritual one still haunt us? The answer has nothing to do with geology and everything to do with the landscape of the human heart. These myths are not really about the history of the earth. They are about the history of our own hopes and fears. The dream of a lost golden age is one of the oldest and most universal stories humanity has ever told. Almost every culture has a version. The Greeks spoke of the golden age of Cronus. The Abrahamic faiths tell of the Garden of Eden. Hindu cosmology speaks of the Satya Yuga. These are all stories of a perfect beginning, a world we have lost through some failing or cosmic turn. The legends of Lemuria and Atlantis are simply the modern, more scientific-sounding incarnations of this ancient, primal archetype. They are our new Edens, our new golden ages, dressed in the language of geology and psychic phenomena. These modern myths blossomed during periods of profound anxiety and dislocation. The 19th and 20th centuries were times of rapid, often brutal industrialization, of world wars, and of a growing sense that humanity, for all its technological progress, had lost its spiritual compass. In a world of smoke-belching factories and looming atomic clouds, the vision of a peaceful, gentle, spiritually advanced civilization like the Lemuria of the New Age mystics was more than fantasy. It was a form of protest. It was a mirror held up to the modern world, a story that quietly asked, "Is this progress? Did we lose something vital along the way?" The lost paradise was a critique of the paradise we had failed to build. There is also a profound comfort in the idea that wisdom is not something we must create, but something we can simply recover. The challenges of our world can feel overwhelming. The myth of Lemuria offers a beautiful shortcut. It suggests the answers to all our problems, how to live in peace, how to heal ourselves and the planet, already exist. They are encoded in a crystal, preserved in a hidden city, or waiting to be channeled from a benevolent master. This is a story of hope and redemption. It tells us we are not truly lost, but have merely forgotten the way home, and that the map is still there, waiting to be found. Furthermore, these stories give us a more glamorous, epic origin story. The slow, messy, and humbling scientific tale of evolution, of humanity as one small branch on a vast tree of life, can sometimes feel unsatisfying. The Lemurian myth offers an alternative in which we are not risen apes, but fallen angels. It gives us a divine heritage, a past where we were giants, psychics, masters of the natural world. It whispers that our current state is a temporary amnesia, and that our true potential is godlike. This is an empowering, deeply attractive idea. It suggests the best parts of us are not the newest, but the oldest, and that awakening is a process of remembering who we truly are. The search for Lemuria, in the end, is not a search for a lost continent. It is a search for a lost part of ourselves, for a better, wiser, more peaceful version of humanity that we sense is possible. A memory of a home we have never known, but have always longed for. And so we find ourselves at the end of this long and winding journey. A story that began with a small, wide-eyed primate and ended with the great, silent movements of the Earth's continents. The tale of Lemuria is a perfect illustration of how an idea, once born, can take on a life of its own, traveling through worlds its creator never could have imagined. It is the biography of a myth that refused to sink even when the scientific ground it was built on had washed away completely. It began so simply in the quiet, methodical world of 19th century science. It was a ghost of pure logic, a phantom continent sketched onto a map by Philip Sclater to solve a frustrating puzzle. It was a respectable hypothesis, an elegant land bridge built of reason and evidence, designed for the sole purpose of letting ancient lemurs walk from India to Madagascar. It was an idea that served its purpose well within the limits of what was known at the time. But the name was too beautiful, and the idea of a lost world too romantic, for it to remain solely in the hands of the scientists. It was adopted by the great mystic Helena Blavatsky, who took the scientific ghost and gave it a soul. In her hands, Lemuria was no longer a simple land bridge, but a vast and ancient stage for the cosmic drama of human evolution, the monstrous and magnificent home of the third root race. Her successors, the clairvoyant chroniclers like William Scott Elliot, then gave that soul a body, filling in the map with mountains and rivers, populating its jungles with dinosaurs, and describing the daily lives of its strange, primitive inhabitants. From there, the story spilled out into the vibrant world of popular fiction. The pulp authors H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Howard found this ready-made lost world and claimed it as their own. They transformed it into a playground for their imaginations, turning it into a place of cosmic horror and alien gods, or a backdrop for sword-swinging, heroic adventure. And in the mid-20th century, the myth bifurcated, splitting into the two great poles of the modern psyche. It became the source of a dark, paranoid nightmare in the bizarre Shaver mystery, and the fountainhead of a beautiful, hopeful dream in the New Age legends of Mount Shasta. Finally, science, which had begun the whole story, returned to finish it. The quiet revolution of plate tectonics provided a new and far more profound truth. The elegant, proven dance of the continents and the reality of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana laid the scientific hypothesis of Lemuria to its final, peaceful rest. A good scientific theory is one that can be tested, and if new evidence comes to light, discarded. As a theory, Lemuria was tested, and it was gracefully discarded. But a good myth is different. A good myth is measured not by its factual accuracy, but by its usefulness to the human heart. A good myth is a vessel that can hold our dreams, our fears, and our deepest longings for meaning. And by that measure, Lemuria is perhaps one of the most successful myths of the modern age. It has been a mirror for our anxieties about our own civilization and a symbol of hope for a better one. Thank you for allowing Sleepy Owl to be a part of your evening.